What's going on, everybody? This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. In today's video, we are going to be talking about genetics. So I have titled this video today, Tampering with Genetics, and we're going to be covering a story that really came out last week on this biotech company, this genetics firm that is experimenting with genetics, which has already essentially harnessed this genetics technology and has claimed to bring back an extinct species of direwolf back into existence. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. I was planning to cover this topic last week, but due to the fact that we did the interview that we did with Jason Owen, which was a great interview, it was, in my opinion, a tremendous success. This topic got pushed back, but I'm actually, in God's providence, glad that this did get pushed back, because even as I was thinking about some of the stuff we talked about in that interview, and you can go back and watch that, we did an interview on the antediluvian world. And as I was thinking about the story that I was going to cover, which I'm covering now today on genetics, I kind of had these dots connect in my head. Like, wait a minute, this is the exact same thing that the Watchers, the fallen angels of the pre-flood world times, this is the same thing that they were doing back then, and that's what's talked about in the book of Enoch. So I'm going to start today by talking about this modern day story and talk about genetics technology as a whole. And then I want to kind of show everybody that there's nothing new under the sun, and I want to talk about how this was going on in the antediluvian world, and I'm kind of connecting those dots. So that's really going to be the purpose of this video today. And I want to start today with this verse of scripture from Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, pretty relatively famous verse, and it says, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." So Daniel was told to take the prophecies of his time, and he was told to seal them up until the time of the end. There would be this time when these prophecies in the latter days, in the last days, would be more relevant. And we are now living in the last days. When you read the book of Revelation, you see the contrast, how it says, have the book be unsealed, for the time is at hand. And, as I was thinking about this subject of genetics and how our knowledge right now of the human species, our knowledge across the world is increasing in many different topics. We don't often know as much as we like to think to know, as we think we know. In our pride, we think that we know everything, and we don't. But regardless, we really do know a lot more than we used to as a species, as the human race. That whether it is in scientific things or in technological matters or even in spiritual things to some extent, we really do see that knowledge is increasing. And we're living in times that are getting, on the one hand, increasingly very scary, because the sinful hearts of men can use this knowledge for great harm. But we're also living in a time that's very exciting. We're living in a time where God is showing us more. And when you're able to look at what is going on in the world in faith, you're able to really ask the question, okay, God, what are you doing in all of this? What are you teaching us in all of this? And that's where even the things that seem really scary can kind of flip and become really exciting. We're living in one of the most exciting times in history, which I know to some extent is kind of a cliche, but we're living in a time where God is showing us, showing the Christian church many things, showing the human race many things. And if we are willing to listen and hear his voice and discern his will and take everything back to scripture and learn from that foundation of a biblical worldview, we're really living in times where great things are happening. And I know I'm kind of getting on my soapbox right away, but this is a really interesting topic, especially when you compare what's going on now with the genetics and compare it to what was going on in the antediluvian world. When you see that we're doing the exact same thing that was going on thousands of years ago, and once you realize that there's nothing new under the sun, it kind of reminds you, it's like, wow, we really are on God's calendar. We really are. The prophetic calendar is moving forward, and it's a good reminder that he's in control, and it's just an amazing time in history to be living in. But all that being said, I know that's kind of a long preface. So this story kind of broke the last few weeks, and I'm going to read a little bit from this. there were many different articles and videos that cover this on the internet. The one I'm going to be reading is from NPR, which, in regards to this story, there's really nothing controversial in the article, so I don't think I'll have to vet my sources more than this. But I just want to read a little bit of this just to set the stage for this conversation, this discussion, if you want to call it that. And the title is A Biotech Company Says It Has Bred Three Pups with Traits of the Extinct Direwolf. And reading a little bit of this article, it says a biotech company says it has bred three animals with key physical features of the direwolf, a species that has been extinct for more than 12,000 years. Colossal Biosciences says it has used novel gene editing technology to alter gray wolf DNA that led to the birth of the pups. Direwolves recently featured prominently in the HBO series Game of Thrones. Our team took DNA from a 13, okay, this is a quote, unquote, our team took DNA from a 13,000-year-old tooth and a 72,000-year-old skull and made healthy direwolf puppies, said Colossal CEO Ben Lamb in a statement. And he said, it was once said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Today, our team gets to unveil some of the magic they are working on and its broader impact on conversation, said Lamb. And then it says, Colossal has announced it has bred four cloned red wolves, the most endangered species in the world, and said its technology could be used to threaten animal populations across the globe rebound. I'm going to stop there. So essentially what they're saying is they took these gray wolves and they used this DNA from these extinct dire wolves, these 13,000-year or 12,000-year-old dire wolves skulls, and they are saying the 13,000-year-old tooth, and then a skull that they are claiming is 72,000 years old, and they're saying that they are taking this old DNA, and they're applying it to the gray wolves, and that they have essentially recreated these direwolves through gene editing technology, through genetics technology. So this is if anybody's like, wait a minute, didn't we watch this movie? Wasn't this Jurassic Park? And yeah, that's exactly what it is. If you remember the movie Jurassic Park, and pretty much all of us I think have seen this film, that they make the dinosaurs and they go and they take the fossilized tree sap and they get the mosquitoes and they take the blood from the dinosaur. This is in the movie, and then they get the DNA code and then they use frogs to fill in the code and they create dinosaurs. And so here we are, fiction has become reality. And we are living in a world where we are trying to recreate extinct species through genetics. That we are living in a world where the science fiction of the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s to a large extent has now become reality. We are living in another world, ladies and gentlemen. And it's really hard for me not to think back to that famous scene in Jurassic Park. And I've quoted this scene multiple times on this channel where they're having lunch in the Jurassic Park film and Dr. Ian Malcolm, famously played by Jeff Goldblum, and he's refuting what they're doing. He's objecting to it. He's saying that this isn't really a good idea. And Dr. Ian Malcolm says that your scientists spent so much time figuring out whether they could do it, they didn't stop to think whether they should. And that's exactly where we are right now. If you go back and watch my video on AI, I said that I really wanted to do a video on genetics, and that's really essentially what I'm doing today. And I gave that same quote then, because just as how we're playing with the proverbial fire with the AI technology and the robotics technology, and we're essentially creating the Terminators that are going to kill us if the Lord. I'm not saying that's actually going to happen in a prophetic sense because we obviously don't know how things are going to happen, but we are playing with that proverbial fire with the robotics and the AI technology. It's the same thing with the genetics. We're playing with things we really don't understand. And the one thing from this clip or from this article where the CEO Lamb, this was really fascinating. Here he said, it was once said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And when I read that, I kind of was floored to some extent because I really couldn't help but think back to what we have talked about on this channel with the Watchers, this group of fallen angels that descended to the earth on Mount Hermon, and that they started sharing their knowledge with humanity. And it was, quote, the practical sciences. They were sharing technology like mining and metallurgy and writing and all of that type of stuff. The women, the beautification of women through makeup and incenses and perfumes. And but they were also teaching what we would call magic, the esoteric sciences, the pharmakia. They used the Greek word for witchcraft, and the use of drugs. It just that's what the Watchers were doing. They were teaching both, and to the human race of that time, it was too like the knowledge of the Watchers included both. It was essentially indistinguishable. So when I read this quote here in this article, how he's saying that really our science and our magic, we're living in a world where they're getting really blurred. We're living in a world, in our modern world, where our scientific capabilities kind of go back to, it almost would appear to be magic to our, even our grandparents or our great grandparents. And, we're just living in a world where we're really catching up to where we were before. Now, I want to illustrate that point a little bit further. But last thing I want to say before I go on to the Watchers is that now it needs to be clarified for the sake of the story that now did they really create dire wolves or not? I'm not a genetics expert by any means. Some people who uh, want a more detailed scientific analysis can go read other stuff. Now, some of the people said that they did not actually create extinct dire wolves. Instead, they would say they essentially created uh, a variation of these gray wolves with some aspects of the dire wolf. So whether they actually created this extinct species or not is a subject of scientific debate. But really the point that I want to make is this genetic technology exists, and we as the human race are using it, and using it with very little caution in my opinion. And so, things that once were the place of science fiction, like genetics and cloning, we are really playing with that proverbial fire. And this isn't the only story of this nature that really shows what we're doing. In 2016, we essentially bred embryos for babies using what was called the three-parent technique, and you can go and look that up. That story broke back in 2016. So we're essentially trying to create babies in the lab with the DNA of three different parents, and so that is one of the things that we are doing. That in a lab setting that we have created human monkey chimeras. The word chimera, essentially a hybrid, and that these embryos lived for a certain period of time before they died. This was all in a lab setting. And this is just the very stuff that's out to the general public. Many people in the quote conspiracy theory realm would say that we are experimenting with this technology at a far faster rate behind the scenes. Groups like the government or the military. But I know some people will get on me for the old conspiracy theory trope. But let's just for the sake of keeping it a little bit grounded today, even what has been broken to the general public in the mainstream scientific community is a lot to really floor us and really show us that we're playing with this technology at an alarming rate. And there are some people who think that we've entered into unprecedented territory in history. And in a sense, in the modern context, we have, no doubt about it. But there is nothing new under the sun. There is nothing that will be that has not been before, to quote Ecclesiastes. And what I really want to show, really connecting this dot back to the Watchers and the antediluvian world, that one of the things when you read an extra biblical book like the Book of Enoch, and I'm actually going to read a brief section of this today, one of the things we're told, and I do believe this is historically accurate, now we know that they cohabitated with human women and created this race of giants, and that led to genetic tampering on the earth. But the other thing that they did was, it says in the book of Enoch that they sinned against the various types of animal life. And really, when you get into it, that they really created chimeras of their own. And when you really look at some of the mythical monsters of history, like the minotaurs or the centaurs, half bull, half man, half horse, half man. The fawns would be the half goat, half man. It's really possible that that mythology, which once again I'm not saying is necessarily completely accurate, it really goes back to that ancient time in history when we were really playing with that, once again, that proverbial fire. And it's amazing that when you read the book of Enoch, once again, it is an extra biblical book. There are some Christians and or professing Christians who have claimed it's inspired. I've never claimed that for myself, but I do think there is historically accurate information in the book of Enoch, even though it is a quote extra biblical book. And it's amazing to me that this book says that it was written for a future time and for for the end times essentially. And it's really even more fascinating when you realize that the Bible does quote from the book of Enoch, even though the skeptics have tried to deny this, even though I think the objections don't hold water. It's amazing to me when you read Jude verses 14 and 15, it talks about how Enoch he quotes this directly from the book of Enoch, and how it talks about how Enoch is prophesying the coming of the Lord, even the second coming of the Lord with his many saints. And we are living in the last days where Christians, we are all, regardless of your positions on eschatology and the millennium and all that, we all agree, if you're Orthodox, that the one thing we are all looking forward to is the second coming of Christ. That's what's called the blessed hope in the scriptures. And Jude prophesies this, and it's amazing when you think about that. That Enoch, the prophet Enoch, prophesied the coming of the Lord, and he not only had understanding of the first coming of the Lord, but he even had, as much as he was able to at that early stage of history, have prophetic understanding of the second coming of the Lord. It's really amazing, and the reason why we know that, when you read Jude, this prophecy is looking forward, New Testament context, after the first coming of Christ, looking forward to the second coming of Christ, quoted from the book of Enoch. That is really paradigm shattering. When you really think about that, you start connecting those dots, you're like, wow. You see what the Lord's doing there. That's cool. It is very cool. But getting back to our main point, just as I read that, it said Daniel, it was told to seal up the book, for the time is not yet at hand. In the same way, the book of Enoch says that it was written for a later time. And therefore, the warnings of what happened at that time in history would have application for the later time in history, which we are living in now. That's why this section here that I'm going to read from First Enoch chapter 7, where it talks about how they were sinning against all the various types of animals, is so interesting and prevalent and relevant for our times. That this genetic stuff, on the one hand, we're playing with fire, and we should learn from what happened in the pre-flood world because it was chaos, but we can also take comfort in the fact that this has happened before and God is in control of it. So as Christians, we can have an appropriate level of concern without falling into an ungodly anxiety and fear. We can still have peace and comfort in our souls that the Lord knows what he's doing, while we can still do what the Lord is calling us to do, to cry out against this, as it were. And I think that's a balanced position. Now, that being said, here I'm going to turn to First Enoch chapter 7. And let me say at this point, if you've never read the book of Enoch, I would highly recommend it. And whether you end up agreeing with it in full, in part, or not at all, it's going to challenge your paradigms. And that's a good thing. If you read this book and you really force yourself to sit down and really wrestle with the contents of it, you're going to be better off for it. So I really would highly recommend, if you've never read the book of Enoch, take some time and read through it. I think you really are gonna profit from it. So this is chapter 7. I'll probably read. It's only 6 verses, so I'll probably read all of it. And it says, and all the others them took unto. This is speaking of the fallen angels called the Watchers here. And it says, all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them and defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. And then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. And then if you go on to read chapter 8, it talks about how Azazel, the leader of these watchers, starts to teach humanity more of their various arts, both the magical side and the quote scientific or technological side, which is so, when I read that quote I read earlier, that CEO is talking about how we've reached the time where science and magic is become inseparable. I kind of spooky, almost as if he's quoting from the Bible, almost as if he's quoting from an extra biblical book like the Book of Enoch. It's spooky that we're living in times where this is so relevant and so prescient. And what's really fascinating here, so we see that these angels, they took wives, they created these children who became giants, and we read about how the giants, once humanity couldn't sustain them anymore and the resources, the food ran out, they started to devour mankind. So you can see what a chaotic dystopian nightmare that was alone. But then it gets even worse when it says, verse 5, this is referring to the watchers, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. And the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. So this is something that's really fascinating, is that the watchers, through, what do you call it, magic or whatever, their understanding of the sciences and magic, they actually started to mess with the various types of animal life and started to create chimeras and hybrids of their own. And then, like I said, this is the inspiration for a lot of mythology around the world, such as Greek mythology. And that this is a big reason why God was having Noah put the untampered with animals onto the ark. Now the skeptics will say that the story still makes sense even if you don't throw that weird component into it, and I get that. But if you really think about it, if these guys are messing with all the animals, then it kind of does, in my opinion, give more context to the story of the ark. Now God would have, he's saving all the land animals from the flood. That part of it alone, I get. You could say that's enough to explain what God is doing. But I would still argue that understanding that the Watchers were creating chimeras and messing with all the animal life gives even more credence to what God was doing. Just as how Noah and his family were kind of this remnant of the pure humans left, um, we see the same thing going on with the animal life. So nothing new under the sun, folks. It's now, I know people who don't believe in the narrative of the Book of Enoch will say that that wasn't going on. But really, this is the direction this channel has gone, is that we affirm the Genesis 6 narrative on this channel. And that this really does show that we are really we're just coming full circle as the human race to where we were before. That just as how the Watchers were doing this in the antediluvian world, and that they taught humanity all this wickedness, and that really humanity really we gave over that dominion to the Watchers and to their children, the Nephilim. And that we really, as humanity, when you read the Book of Enoch, it's amazing how things finally got so bad that humanity began to cry out to the Lord. And that finally the Lord uses someone like Enoch to proclaim this judgment upon the Watchers. And he says that you should have been pleading for humanity. It's an amazing story. It really, really is an amazing story. And we have so much more clarity when you read not only the inspired narrative of Scripture, but you read some of this historical information, gives even more credence to it. I love there's the quotation from Michael Heiser where he said the apostles read books, or the prophets read books, the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament apostles, that these guys read books. from other stuff. And we know that the Jewish community at Qumran, the Essenes, they were reading the Book of Enoch. This was part of the literature in Israel in the first century. So we shouldn't be afraid of the Book of Enoch. We should be willing to read it. And when you really accept that there's historical truth in that narrative, and it really does show that it really was for a later time, we've come full circle. And just as we're playing with the proverbial fire with genetics in our day, and we really should see that we're really just come back to a time in history where God said we would come, and that's exactly where we are. Now we can debate, eschatology and where the end times is going to take us, on a different video. I've given my opinions on that in other videos, but I just think it's fascinating that we're at this time in history where some of these things that were talked about in the ancient past now with science has brought us, our scientific understanding has brought us to a point where that stuff that was talked about in the Book of Enoch actually makes sense. That type of language of sinning against the animals and then the land crying out because it's such an abomination, that that really, with what we understand now, that actually makes so much more sense than it probably has for centuries. And that's fascinating. And that kind of brings me back full circle to what I was talking about before. Um, that this is something that we are, what's what do I want to say here? That we're living in times on the one hand that are very scary. They're scary because we are playing with the proverbial fire, and that humanity, we really don't know what we're playing with. If you've ever heard of the theory of the inevitability thesis, and this thesis essentially, which I think is generally true, that the inevitability thesis says that whenever humanity discovers a technology, it's essentially, because of our human nature, it's essentially inevitable that we're going to explore it and develop this technology and use it pretty much to its full potential. And in a sense, I would say that we cannot stop, as our capabilities increase, we cannot stop our own destruction. And the only caveat I would give to that is, apart from the grace of God, apart from the Spirit of God leading us and guiding us and even protecting us from ourselves, from our own flesh, our own sin, we are doomed as the human race. If it isn't for God's Spirit being poured out and the Holy Spirit working amongst the human race to lead us away from our sinful ability to self-destruct, we are doomed. We really are. And but really, that's the scary side of where we are. But on the flip side of that, we're living in a time of history where knowledge is increasing. Going back to what I said in Daniel 12:4, and just as it's not just scientific knowledge, there's a lot of areas where knowledge is increasing amongst the human race, even in spiritual matters. That's very exciting. Things like the Book of Enoch, for example, that we've just talked about here on this video, it's becoming more widely read amongst Christians, amongst evangelical Christians. And some of this theology, stuff like what Michael Heiser did with the divine counsel technology, people are really looking at texts like Psalm 82 in a fresh way, really understanding what the Bible teaches about the angels and the divine counsel, and what Psalm 82 refers to as the gods, the lowercase g gods. There's a huge amount of growth and knowledge in those areas, in the embrace of the Genesis 6 narrative, that more and more Christians are embracing that. And there's so many other areas where we really do see that even though a lot of these concepts are still more fringe, that these things are growing. On this channel, a lot of times I've talked about how, kind of jokingly, I try to be upbeat about how people don't like what I'm talking about. But you know what? There's a lot of people who get back to me or email me or respond to me, and they really do see these truths for themselves. And they say, Joe, what you were talking about, it's exactly what God has been teaching me in my own life. And then that's the plus side of it. That's the exciting side of it, is I really do think that God is leading the church and many Christians into more truth, the church into more truth. Not all Christians, not all churches, but here and there, that people are having their eyes open to more and more, and knowledge really is increasing in many areas, in the good and the bad. So we're living in times, on the one hand, that are very, very scary and frightening, apart from the fruits of the Spirit, apart from the peace of God that passes all understanding. It is very scary because we're playing with stuff that we really don't understand, like I've said multiple times. But the flip side of it is that we are living in times where God is showing us, those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, he is showing us more. And that's really exciting. So we're living in a time in history where it's kind of like the stakes are being raised on both sides. The dark side is working harder than it ever has, but then the light side, the Lord's forces are working as well. So we're in this spiritual war, we're in this conflict, and we really are in an exciting time of history. And when you really understand what's going on with the genetics and you understand it in the context of the flow of history, that this stuff was going on even in the primordial days of our history, and you understand that we're doing the exact same things in our modern times, it really is, all those dots connect, and it is just exciting, scary, um, profound, all at the same time. It just, when you start to connect those dots in your mind, you're like, wow, we are wow, God's really putting a lot of things in front of us for us to see. And so I'm going to stop there because I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to repeat myself a little bit. But yeah, the exciting stuff, scary stuff, genetics, I think that I really do hope that more Christians look into this, read this. One of the things I will say is we really do need some Christians. I don't think I'm necessarily called to do it, but we really need Christians to really write on the ethics of artificial intelligence and genetics. And we really need Christians to write those kind of Michael Heiser PhD academic papers on these topics, and or write books on these topics, and really kind of push back against the secular view, which is just go, 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 go. And we really need some Christians who are called into those spaces to really say where we really need to hit the brakes. And this topic today, it kind of touches upon what God has called me to talk about, but it's not necessarily my primary lane, but it certainly touches upon my lane if I want to talk about it that way. But we really do need guys to really go at this and look at this. And so that's really where we're at. So just things to think about. Very very scary what we're doing. This technology exists. We're living in science fiction. Jurassic Park is real, more or less, and that's really where we're at. So once again, this video is tampering the human race. We are tampering with genetics. So that's really what we've covered today. So guys, stay tuned for what's next with Reformed Truther Ministries. More exciting stuff coming down the pike. So all that being said, I hope God is blessing you wherever you're at. This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless you. If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.